Hi, everyone. We're excited to have everyone here today. And we're going to go ahead and get started. So welcome to our youth activism workshop. So as a part of our long tradition of working actively towards racial equity and our commitment to improving and diversifying the historical perspective, we are proud to present to you the first installment of our How Did We Get Here? Or actually, this isn't the first, I apologize. This is our second youth workshop, our first one for older students of our installation of How Did We Get Here? Conversations about race, anti-Blackness, and identity series. Many people refer to the current climate as a summer of awakening. And in many ways, this entire series is designed to awaken and provoke you to see history in a different light. As the Missouri Historical Society, it is our job to provide historical perspectives on timely issues and cross historic, economic, and racial divides in order to tell the stories of everyone who calls the St. Louis region home. I want to first applaud each of you for participating in this discussion, in this webinar. So we're going to be talking about some heavy things. It may feel uncomfortable in times, but it is important to create this space where dialogue and deep discussion may happen. And granted, we can't see each other, we can't hear each other, we can't talk, but we're still going to be having these conversations. We acknowledge that each of you have a different vantage points based on your lived experience, but please utilize this time to listen to different perspectives and gain knowledge. It is our job to bring proactive voices to the forefront. And with that being said, we're going to go ahead and get started. I do want to let everybody know that a survey will pop up at the end. If you are under the age of 18, it will not let you take the survey. So if you have a caretaker with you, go ahead and have them take it for you. So on that note, we're going to get started. So this is our How Did We Get Here? Conversations on Race, Anti-Blackness, and Identity. And this is our older student youth workshop. So just to go over a few things, this is webinar based. We will ask a lot of questions, answer them by typing your answers into the chat. Also, if you have a question at that time, we ask that you use just the chat function instead of the Q&A. Drop it in there and we will try to get to your question as soon as possible. This is going to be followed by an open style conversation. So I'll drop that Zoom link into the chat later on. And you can follow it up. That one will not be meeting based. So this is webinar based. So I can't see you, I can't hear you. I can only communicate with chat. But the other one will be meeting based, which means we will be able to see each other. We will be able to talk. So keep your eye on the chat for that. Also, embrace the chaos. This is all brand new. This summer has been, everything is brand new with getting things online. So we're all in the same boat. So I just want to set some brave space rules. I first ask that you listen fully and respectfully. Granted, we aren't actually physically listening, but we are hearing people. Seek first to understand, ask questions to clarify, not to debate. We want to understand where each person is coming from, and we're not always going to agree, and that is okay. Speak for yourself, not as a representative of any group. So for example, I would probably be speaking today just as I, Sarah, not as a representative of white people, not as a representative of women, not as a representative of every millennial. I'm just speaking from me. And that also means that we're not going to place that pressure on anybody. We are not going to ask anybody to be a spokesperson for any of their identities either. Make an effort to suspend your own judgment as you listen and assume positive intent. We all made the choice to be here today. So we're all here and we're all going to assume we're here for a positive reason. So today we're going to be checking in. We're going to be defining some terms. We're going to look at how we got here through the lens of St. Louis history. We're going to learn about some activists and reflect on what we can do. So let's start off with, go ahead and drop this in the chat. How are you all feeling today? In just 1 or 2 words. I see overwhelmed. Yeah. Tired. Someone said happy and content. Yeah, we can be all over the spectrum. You know, I had someone message me the other day that they were like, I have this dichotomy with everything. I just got this job and I'm so happy, but with everything going on in the world, it feels this, you can have both. Two things can be true. I see focused. I see hopeful. Yeah. Those are all valid. Yeah. So we're kind of all on different spectrums, and that's amazing. So my next question is, what is something you were thinking about or wondering about? Before we get started today, I want you to think about what is something you've been thinking about a lot lately or have questions on. This is just so we can kind of see what people are curious about and what they might be hoping to get out of today. So we'll go ahead and take a few minutes to do that. So I think this is quite a great question. Someone said, are people really going to stay engaged to create real change in our community? And I think that's something that I've seen a lot of people wondering about. Like, once the big news story is over, are we still going to keep that work up? The world feels so negative and sad right now. How can I play a role in improving things for my family and those around me? Yeah. So thinking about that next action, I see someone said something I can do to make a difference. Yeah. So I think a lot of us are wondering, what can we do? What is our role? What's next? How do we keep up this change? Excellent. So we just kind of did that. I just wanted to check in with everybody today because, like I said, this is an emotional topic. These are hard times and we're all over the place, you know. We're all existing in this larger world as well as our own personal world. So it's always really good to check in and to see where everyone is at. So thank you all so much for doing that with me. So I am now going to pass this over to my friend Zakora, who is a K-12 museum educator, and she's going to get us started on our first section of defining some terms.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Zakora, as Sarah just said. I think that it's important when we're having these very large discussions that are very deep, have a lot of different, components to them, that we are all on the same page about what words mean. So what we're going to do together is we're just going to go through and do some defining of terms, okay? So first, we want to look at oppression. Oppression is the malicious exertion of power, often but not only under the false pretense of government authority and cultural censure. Oppression can be overt, meaning outright, or covert, meaning hidden, depending on how it is practiced. The other thing that we want to talk about today is intersectionality. Intersectionality is the way different forms of oppression combine and overlap. For example, intersectionality allows us to examine the way being both Black and poor contributes to the silencing of Black voices in the criminal justice system. We cannot adequately discuss oppression or intersectionality, however, without talking about racism. So, racism, defined by us, is prejudice based on racial identity and skin color plus power. Power is very important to this definition because that is the lens through which racism is experienced. Someone who is being racist is always doing so from a place of power and privilege, whether they know it or not. This is why reverse racism, for example, does not exist, because even if people of color are prejudiced towards white people still maintain a greater level of power and privilege in society at large due to systemic racism and oppression. So in thinking about racism, we also want to think about what racism looks like. Oh, I'm sorry. In thinking about what racism looks like. So racism can look like many things, but I want to ask you guys a question. You could briefly type in the chat maybe what racism looks like to you. I'm going to give you guys some time to think about that. It doesn't have to be a long answer. It can be something really simple, a quick example. I see someone said microaggressions. Absolutely. Or things like being followed around a retail store. Mm-hmm. Anyone has anything else to add? Denying a person a job or opportunity because of race. Absolutely, absolutely. I know I can always find products for my hair and skin tone, but everyone else doesn't have that privilege. Yes, I appreciate that you're recognizing that there even things that you notice are easy for you, that may be harder for others, can contribute to racism or forms of racism. Absolutely. So you guys are pointing out some really great things, and that is that racism can be both overt, such as denying someone a job because of their race, or it can be covert, like following them around in the retail store, or a lack of resources. Behind my chat here. Okay, so we're gonna look at a graphic that maybe explains this just a little bit more. Yeah, so as we can see, we mentioned that racism can be both overt and covert, meaning if it's overt, it's oftentimes deemed considered socially acceptable, I would say, such as lynching. I'm sorry, I said that backwards. Racism can be overt, meaning it's considered socially unacceptable, with things such as lynching, maybe using racial slurs, or the KKK. But there are also forms of racism that are socially accepted. And these covert forms, such as following someone around in the retail store, or things like Make America Great Again, which we see on our graphic here. I'm going to try to annotate this so you guys can follow along with me. I will. Maybe we'll embrace the chaos. My annotation isn't working at the moment. But if you can see to the left of the pyramid here, right under the line, we have things like Make America Great Again. We have color blindness, and maybe even expecting Black people and other people of color to teach white people. These are all different forms of covert racism that are more socially accepted, but are still harmful to Black people and other persons of color. Some may ask, how is Make America Great Again racist? Well, it's a slogan that was built on bigotry and praises America for its racist and discriminatory practices. Something like color blindness, or the idea that one doesn't see color, is often thought of as a positive, but what it actually does is it negates the lived experiences of Black and brown people, which are often inherently tied to the color of their skin. By choosing to not see color, you're not able to truly see or hear Black and brown people or their struggles. And this is another form of identity erasure. The last example that I gave was the expectation that Black people and other people of color should teach white people and help them to be better or not racist. But that is in itself inherently racist because it implies that there's an entitlement to the emotional, mental, or even physical labor of Black people and people of color, which is very dangerous. And it's a false concept that I would say is left over from the era of chattel slavery. If white people want to learn, they should seek information on their own from people who are vocal about, wanting to teach and educate. So yeah, I know that was a lot. Do we have any questions? If you do, you can go ahead and just type them in the chat. If you don't have any questions, can I get you all to type "got it" into the chat box? All right. Seeing a lot of "got it." Ooh, is that a question? What are good responses or solutions to some of the covert racist items? That is a really good question. I'm going to think on it for a second, but if any of my fellow panelists have maybe a response that comes directly into mind, you can feel free to answer, but I'm going to take a second to just think on this question.
I'm going to throw out there that afterwards we're going to be having an open dialogue conversation with an amazing facilitator, Tabari. And Tabari is someone who is really good at having these conversations and thinking about how to respond to moments of bias. So I might actually put that in our parking lot and readdress that afterwards, because I think that is an amazing question that I think we're very good at answering.
All right, so we're going to put that in the parking lot, as Sarah said. So since we're all on the same page about what these words mean, it's very important that we begin to ask ourselves a very big question. And my friend Victoria is going to help us with that and maybe try to help us find some answers.
All right. Ooh, here's all over the place. Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us today. So we are starting here at our overarching question of how did we get here? So before I start on this section, I just want to do a really quick kind of thought experiment and just kind of think about what images or what words come to mind when you hear these different words I'm about to give to you. You don't have to type them in the chat, but just kind of think of what images or emotions they evoke for you. So the first word is riot. Riot. So kind of think about that for a second. And the second word I have for you is massacre. Massacre. So hopefully you have kind of images or kind of emotions that these words evoke for you. And I imagine they can evoke two pretty different types of emotions for you, but they both have some common themes like destruction or violence. So before we start into this next section, I want to give you a content warning. Just because we're going to be discussing a few heavy topics in this section that include violence and death. So we wanted to warn you before we jump in. We will not be going into graphic detail, but we will be looking at violence in this section. So we're going to take a look at some historic examples specific to St. Louis. And while we're doing this, though, I really want you to keep in mind that while these things are specific to St. Louis, these certain instances, they are not an exception to the rule. If anything, they are more the rule. And you see this over and over again in different cities across the U.S. So here we have a quote from Theodore Roosevelt, our 26th president of the US. And it says, "The more you know about the past, the better prepared you are for the future." So we hope that by looking at some of these examples of discrimination and of oppression, like the definition we just looked at, it'll better prepare all of us, all of you, for the future and to be able to take action and make change. So the first example we have is of a race massacre. So really in 1910, that was kind of the beginnings of the Great Migration, which is where African Americans who were largely based in the rural South, of course from being enslaved in the South, they began to migrate north for more jobs, more freedom, and better opportunities to grow their communities and grow their families. But while they migrated north, there was also more tension with the white communities that were already established in the north. And like I said, it's more the rule. So for example, you might have recently heard or learned about the Tulsa Race Massacre that really destroyed Black Wall Street in Tulsa, where it was kind of Tulsa, Oklahoma. And that was the kind of epicenter of Black commerce and entrepreneurship in that city. And so again, with the idea that it's kind of was the rule, the summer of 1919, was actually called Red Summer. And there were, that summer alone, so like in the 3 months of summer, there were over 25 different racially motivated massacres across the country where Black citizens were attacked and they were lynched, and their communities were burned and destroyed. So the example we're going to look at is from right across the Mississippi River in East St. Louis. So this occurred in the summer of 1917. As we stated before, there were a lot of tensions, specifically focusing on East St. Louis. These tensions came up because the white workers were actually going on strike to have higher pay in their factory-based jobs. As this was happening, the African-American migrants from the South were coming in, and they were readily available to, have this work and to start building their own wealth for their families. So this created a tension, and a lot of the communities, the white communities that were already established there, felt like the Black workers were kind of taking over. And also a thing to note is that these people living in these communities, both here in St. Louis and also in East St. Louis, they sympathize with the South in their institution and destruction of slavery. So it really started, it began to escalate on the eve of July 1st, but all of the violence and destruction really took place on July 2nd. And this was happening in broad daylight. African Americans were attacked. They originally began attacking the workers, for taking the jobs, but it quickly escalated into attacking and killing even African American children. They would rip kids from their mother's arms off the streetcars. They would brutally beat people just walking in the street or just existing in their space. And so in this riot, the white rioters also destroyed 300 homes and buildings in 12 square blocks. So 12 square blocks, not just 12 blocks, but square blocks of the Black community that lived in East St. Louis. So in today's dollar amount, that is $7 million in property damage. So throughout this day, it was reported that over 30 people were murdered, but it was actually closer to, people at that time estimated to be closer to 100 to 250 African American victims who were murdered by these white mobs. So in the aftermath, there was a silent parade in New York City. That's how big the event was, that it reached all the way to New York. And the NAACP organized this silent parade to honor the lives of the Black victims, and also of all of the African American families that had to flee because their homes and communities were destroyed. They had to flee across the Mississippi River to start a new life in a new community, and it left a lot of them traumatized because it was a very traumatizing event to witness. So now I want you to kind of think about this event, this race massacre I just talked about, and I want you to try to think of how your view of the events might be different if I had instead called it the East St. Louis Race Riot or the East St. Louis Race War. So I want to hear your thoughts on how you believe language is important. How does it shape how we understand an issue or event? Please let us know in the chat box. Let's see. Someone says words are connected to such strong imagery that by using certain ones, it creates a mental image. Yeah. Let's see. Someone says, I would have thought it was Black on Black because East St. Louis is almost 100% Black now. Yeah. Yeah, it is really interesting how neighborhoods are able to change and evolve over time, especially we see this throughout history again and again as Black families and communities start to grow in certain neighborhoods, the the white people or the white communities that were there tend to disperse and start new communities, for sure. Words create emotional responses. They do. Because for a lot of people who experience this traumatizing event, they actually, they called it a race war. So that's how they experienced it. Massacre is a much stronger word than riot, and that's exactly what this event depicted, right? Massacre is stronger. It implies kind of one person, or not one person, but one-sided violence. Words may also make us feel a lot of things, and small word changes can create a whole new meaning. Right. And even today, the news recently, some of the peaceful protests in the wake of George Floyd's murder, the news depicted them as violent riots. But really, if you saw other accounts and maybe on social media, you would see that a lot of these protests were actually very peaceful. So words can definitely create and shape how we view events. So now we're going to look at a bit of destruction of neighborhoods, um, which St. Louis has a history of doing. And again, not an exception to the rule, more of the rule. So this destruction can be overt or covert. And so overt, as we talked about before with overt racism, it's the like actual destruction and removal of these neighborhoods. Usually it's under the guise of urban renewal, um, things like building highways in the middle of communities. Um, and covert policies are more of, they kind of go under the surface and are more economic attacks, which could be pushing businesses out of Black neighborhoods or not expanding public transportation and giving people, the right access to, grocery stores that have fresh food and other resources that we need to survive. So we are going to look at a community here in St. Louis. It's a part of St. Louis County, but it's called Kinloch, Missouri. So the image on the right is an advertisement from when Kinloch was formerly known as Kinloch Park. In the early 1900s. It was a predominantly white commuter suburb, which is why, if you can see, there's a little train saying it leaves from Union Station. Um, so that was the kind of origin. But as more African Americans migrated north and settled in cities like St. Louis, you kind of see that white flight that I kind of talked about before, where the white people who lived in that community go to other communities and start their own community. So Kinloch is a significant place to talk about because it is the oldest African American community to be incorporated in the entire state of Missouri. And that incorporation happened in 1948. So when a community or town is incorporated, it basically means they can elect their own officials to represent them. So they have greater pull in the community as a whole. So they can have like a mayor and those other elected officials that will advocate for them. So at its height, it was really thriving. It had a population of about 15,000 people. And it was even nicknamed Harlem of the Midwest because there were so many Black creators and entrepreneurs. There were also Black doctors and lawyers. And basically, it was a really tight-knit community that provided nearly every resource you can think of for its citizens right in that community. They didn't even have to leave to, go to the doctor or go to school. They had their own school district. So it was a very thriving and robust community. But that all started to change in the 1980s when Lambert Airport began buying out private property, so private homes in Kinloch. And that was really kind of the beginning of the downfall of this vibrant community. And between 1990 and 2000, the community lost 75% of its residents. So three, three-fourths of their residents. And according to the 2010 census, less than 300 people resided in Kinloch. So another community that was similarly a very much so a African American community hub was Mill Creek Valley. So Mill Creek Valley was a neighborhood in the city of St. Louis. So that was the county, but this is the city of St. Louis, where it was kind of a center for African American cultural life in St. Louis. This was also a place with hundreds of businesses and thriving institutions, and especially in the 1950s. There were grocery stores, schools, churches, and it was home to an African American newspaper as well. But around the 1950s, leaders started calling for, more economic and civic development for the city. That created the Urban Renewal Project, which Mill Creek Valley was literally right in the middle of this development plan. So, and this plan was to build interstate, so Highway 60, I-64, and it was right in the middle of this thriving community. So the locals tried to fight back by protesting on the grounds that other cities were actually in worse shape than Mill Creek, but it was to no avail. So as we see in these two examples, and in other communities in St. Louis as well, and of course around the country, these neighborhoods were Black hubs of excellence, commerce, and a source of pride for the people who lived there. And so we kind of see the overt and covert destruction of these communities through these two examples. So I want to ask, what evidence do we see of this destruction today? What evidence in our city or maybe across the US do we see from the destruction of predominantly Black neighborhoods? You all can type answers into the chat below. Oh, someone said the Delmar Divide. Yeah, for sure. Are you all familiar with that term, Delmar Divide? Yep. It refers to Delmar Boulevard, which goes east and west. Ooh, yes. Let's see. Oh, I thought I saw a comment. Oh, yes. Yes, someone said those neighborhoods are left in ruins and only the people who cannot afford to move out are left there. Yeah, like in Kinloch, a lot of people now from outside the community actually go there to dump trash into that community. Yeah. And definitely, yeah, like someone else said, the Delmar Divide, for sure. It refers to Delmar Boulevard, which kind of cuts the city in half almost, and segregates the city. Right. So yeah, like I said before, St. Louis is not the only example of this destroying thriving Black communities and neighborhoods. This is and it was the rule for so long in so many different cities across the United States. So now we'll take a look at some of the different kind of overt and covert policies that were used to orchestrate this segregation and destruction. So we are going to hear from Emily now.
Thank you very much, Victoria. I really appreciate it. So as we're thinking about how we got here to this moment of activism, of hopefully making progress on these issues, Again, it's just really important to understand kind of where we came from to get to this moment. So looking at St. Louis in terms of segregation, we're going to look at some of that history of how segregation was enforced through policy and social action, more of what we would consider some of that covert discrimination or covert oppression, in that it was like people said, sure, this policy seems fine. We will definitely accept that. The thing to keep in mind as we look ahead at some of this history that we're going to talk about is that segregation in cities is not organic and spontaneous. People don't cluster together into areas just because they think it sounds great. So much of the segregation that we see today from things like the Del Mar Divide, it's the result of very deliberate decisions and policies, racist policies from governments and civic leaders around the country. But we're going to look at it right here in St. Louis, especially. Okay. So first thing we're going to look at is a practice called redlining. If you have heard of redlining before, drop it in the chat, just like a yes or a no, if you have heard of redlining before. Even if you don't necessarily know what it is, just a yes or a no. Okay, so yes, or heard a little bit. No, we haven't. Yes, yes. So this might be a term that we are a little bit familiar with, but there are people who've never heard of this policy before. Or if you have heard of it, maybe you're not completely familiar with what it actually was. So redlining was the practice of creating a map that a bank would use to tell them which areas were best for offering mortgages and investments and which areas they should avoid investing in through mortgages. We're specifically talking here about home ownership. This was in the wake of the Great Depression. Country was trying to recover from the Great Depression, and they wanted people to purchase homes. So what the policy became was that cities that were looking to kind of really rebuild and get people to invest by buying homes would create a map. And if you look over here on the slide at this map, this is a map of the city of St. Louis from the year 1937, and it is color-coded. The green areas were considered the best areas to offer mortgages. These were the nicest houses, the newest areas, and they were predominantly white and very, very affluent, very prosperous. They had lots of money for investment. The blue areas were the second best level, still considered pretty good for investment, like white collar jobs. If you worked in those areas, you could invest. That was considered good for investment there. The yellow areas were the areas that were considered not great, not the best areas for investment. But the red areas, the areas that were outlined in red, which is where the term redlining comes from, were the areas that were considered detrimental or hazardous to offer people mortgages or to invest in those areas. These were the areas that were populated by immigrants and Black and brown families, overwhelmingly. And this was done very deliberately. Those areas were considered not worth the investment in, even though the people who lived in those areas had jobs and were capable of paying their mortgages. The banks deliberately chose not to offer mortgages for home ownership. The reason this is so problematic beyond just the racial implications is because homeownership is the #1 creator of generational wealth. And Black families were left out of that. They couldn't purchase homes to be able to build that kind of wealth and then be able to pass it on to their children and their grandchildren so that their future generations could be in a good position. And also because families couldn't buy homes in these redlined areas of the city, there were a lot of other effects of that. Businesses left because there weren't families and solid base to support those businesses. Property values went down because people weren't owning, instead they were renting or in temporary housing. And when property values go down, infrastructure is affected. Property taxes are a big way that we pay for things like fixing potholes and sidewalk repair. When you don't have the property value to be able to pay for that, you can't fix those things. You also can't fund schools. This is a major way that public schools are funded. And when property values go down because people can't purchase homes, the schools aren't properly funded. And then also, white families fled for the suburbs. They left to go to other areas, and that decreased the population and left only Black and brown families left behind with very few areas that they could go to. And the reason that they had few areas to go to was something called restrictive covenants. So let's go to the next slide and take a look at that. Restrictive covenants were contracts made between white homeowners requiring them not to sell or even rent their homes to families of specific minority groups, specifically Black families. They weren't allowed to sell their homes in areas to that. And St. Louis had a long history of discriminating against Black and brown families using restrictive covenants. But St. Louis also has a history of activism against restrictive covenants. In fact, the Supreme Court case that made restrictive covenants unenforceable or made them illegal to continue started right here in St. Louis with this house you're looking at. This is the house at 4600 Labadie Avenue. It wanted to be, in 1947, a man named J.D. Shelley wanted to purchase this home for his family. He was a Black man, and the restrictive covenant on this home said that he could not purchase it. They started a court case. It went all the way up to the Supreme Court, where it was ruled unenforceable. They couldn't do that anymore. This home actually still stands in the 4600 block of Labadie Avenue. You can go see it as a sign of the activism in terms of ways that we improved housing fairness. It's part of the National Register of Historic Landmarks. So both of these policies, redlining and restrictive covenants, are very clear examples of ways that racism shows up in policy and contributes to that segregation. I think it's really important to think about what information that we just talked about is new to you. I want you to take about 15 seconds, it's not a lot of time, but I want you very quickly to drop in the chat what information is new to you that you had not known before today or that you hadn't really thought about before. Put that in the chat very quickly, please. So just redlining in general is a new idea. Yeah, I think sometimes we think, oh, segregation just happens. People of a certain race live here, other people of a different race live here. That's just normal, but it's actually really a big part of specific policy that people put into place. Yeah, surprised that St. Louis was the start of the restrictive covenant case. Yeah, we're actually a major part of history in terms of that section in terms of housing discrimination. So in the same way that we were a place where restrictive covenants were applied, we were also a place where restrictive covenants were knocked down. Yeah, so something to consider as we continue talking about this history is, why don't we talk about these things more? Who gets to decide what's part of the history curriculum? One of the things we do at the History Museum is try and tell those different stories that you might not have known about. And so now you can go forward and have conversations prepared for more, armed with more knowledge of how these things work. So one more area of history that St. Louis plays a significant part in is the area of over-policing. So I'm gonna let Sarah take over and tell you more about that.
So this is something that has been in the news a lot lately, I'm sure, is over-policing of Black neighborhoods. And this kind of also falls into the kind of more covert ways that we destroy certain neighborhoods and communities. So some of the earliest police forces were actually formed to control enslaved people with slave patrols. So they were to watch the comings and goings of Black citizens in that area. When slavery ended, they also found a loophole that they could still get free labor because prisoners didn't count under the 13th Amendment. So they didn't have to pay for labor. And this started the convict lease system, which was actually almost more horrendous than slavery in a way, because they were not accountable for the people at all. They just got like 10 people, and if one person were to die from being overworked or something, they just got another person. In order to fill up prisons, they created Black codes, which criminalized the everyday action of Black folks and citizens. And today, most officers patrolling Black neighborhoods and communities aren't from those places. And policing in predominantly Black schools and living spaces enforces this culture of incarceration. So as you all know, one of our major moments in history is the Ferguson unrest, which was the shooting of teenager Mike Brown by police officer Darren Wilson. They left his body out for a very long time, which was very upsetting for a lot of people. The St. Louis County prosecutor did not recommend any charges, and ultimately that is what ended up happening. After 3 months of deliberation, there were no charges brought against Officer Wilson, which sparked another round of unrest. Then a federal court found that there was racial bias in the town's policing, and that was the DOJ Ferguson report. So this quote right here, it says, but a second investigation into the Ferguson police force and court system at large found widespread racial bias in the city's institutions, including they were quick to escalate force, and when they did, African Americans accounted for 90%. Explicit racial bias in communications between police and the court. The court's practices impose unnecessary harm overwhelmingly on African Americans, including arrest warrants are issued if fines are not paid instead of on the basis of public safety. Many officers who appear to see some residents, especially those in Ferguson's predominantly African American areas, less as constituents to be protected than as potential offenders and sources of revenue for the city. So this was the major report. Now, this is a big moment in our history, but we talked about other moments that at that time were really big that we don't really talk about as much. So my question for you all to think about, and we're not going to answer this today, but we're going to think about it, is who and how do we decide what is history? Will we be talking about Ferguson in 50 to 60 years? I'm sure people at the time of the East St. Louis race massacre thought that. So who decides? How do we decide what's going to stick around and who decides? So I want you to keep that in mind. And I am now going to pass this over to Alyssa, who's going to kind of quickly go over a few things that people have done to fight back.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. So we have gone over various cases of oppression, racism, and prejudice. And now we want to talk about how have people responded to this over the years? What have people done? And so the people who respond to these things publicly are activists. Activists are people who take action to make a change in society for what they think is the greater good for everyone. Let's look at a few examples. So Ferguson activists. So starting with Michael Brown Sr., who was Michael Brown's father. After losing his son to police brutality, him and Michael's mother both started charities, including the Michael Brown Chosen for Change charity, which insists that all patrolling police officers wear a body cam. And he also travels to schools to talk to parents and elected officials and marches and protests with other parents who are, their children were victims of police brutality. And then we also have Alicia Sunnier, who was actually still in high school during this time. But her response to the Michael Brown incident was to create the activist group Tribe X. So Tribe X is dedicated to establishing alliances through community education. And she also travels to colleges and speaks with students to promote activism in youth. And we have housing activists, in particularly Ivory Perry, who fought against the effects of redlining by standing up for families living in substandard housing conditions. He found a huge problem with lead paint in many of the houses in those communities and demanded the city take action to protect children and families from harm. And he led protests and demonstrations for many different causes related to improving the living conditions in underprivileged neighborhoods. And then we have job activists, Percy Green and Richard Daley. These two protested the construction of the arch for unfair hiring practices. So the commissioners promised jobs to African Americans. However, when it came to time to build the arch, they only hire white construction workers. And so Green and Daley climbed the arch and shut down construction. And then we have the Committee of Racial Equality Corps. And they, I'm so sorry, I'm having technical difficulties there. When Jefferson Bank moved from a predominantly Black neighborhood to a white neighborhood, they refused to hire skilled Black workers. They organized protests and sit-ins outside of the bank that lasted for 7 months, starting in April 1963.
Thank you so much, Alyssa. So what's next, right? We've talked about all these historical examples. We've talked about all these issues. So what is next? Now, we all have the power to make change. We all have the power to make the world better, and it can be in very large ways or very small ways. So I want you all to think about, what is one thing you can do, or what is one thing you can do to create, to be an activist or make change? I want you to think about that as we go on. What can you do to be an activist? And here's some examples of things that we thought about. So someone said, I can attend a protest. So we kind of thought about this as different sections. There's the smaller things you can do today, like sign a petition. Go up here and look up a petition you care about. Follow some activists on Twitter to continue education. In a week, you can start continuing to work on educating yourself. You can self-reflect. You can email a local official. You can share important information. Over a month's time, you can do you can get even bigger. And again, it doesn't matter where you're at. You know, sometimes activism can be small or it can be large. You can vote and encourage others to vote. I know some of you probably are under the age of 18, so you can't quite vote yet, but I'm sure you know adults in your life who you can encourage. You can create a letter for people to send to officials. You can volunteer with an activist organization or campaign. And then there's like the really, really long-term change. Remember that change doesn't happen overnight. We can take those small actions, but it's a long process, and some things take a really long time. For example, over the year with a group of friends, you can advocate for more diverse authors and representation at your school. You can raise money. You can continue educating yourself and advocating for anti-racist teaching in your school. So there's some smaller things and there are some larger things that you can do. I wanted to end on this, or not end quite on this, but before we ended, I want to talk about results, because we hear about all these things happening that are really rough. We hear about all of these different things, but what are the results? So far right now with the George Floyd protests, George Floyd's murderers were arrested. And on top of that, another result was Breonna Taylor's case came to national attention. And it hadn't been before, it hadn't really been talked about. And it was suddenly now back into the attention. And granted, they haven't been arrested, but the city of Louisville did pass a Breonna Taylor law, which banned no-knock warrants. Or basically now you can't enter the house without showing a warrant first, without just being able to bust in. The Jefferson Bank protest we just talked about, they protested for 7 months. And at the end, they finally hired 4 African-American employees. And the Close the Workhouse campaign. Some of you may or may not be familiar with it, but this was a campaign addressing prison reform, and they worked on closing the workhouse, a prison with poor conditions. And just last week, the Board of Aldermen voted to close the workhouse, and now the bill has gone to the mayor. So none of this was easy. The Close the Workhouse campaign was years of work. Jefferson Bank was 7 months of people coming out every day. So this is something that happens overnight. But slow work and small and large actions can create change. So we wanted to end on this. We wanted you all to think about this. We're gonna what we call a 1-minute paper. And you can type this in, you can write this down, you can think about it. But in our last few minutes, I want you to think about, what is the most surprising and or unexpected idea from today's session? And what interesting questions do you have that we did not answer today? So go ahead and take a minute to type that into the chat. And while you all are doing that, I want to drop the link to our Zoom meeting afterwards. So you can see I'm about to put this in the chat. This is where we're going to be meeting to have to continue the dialogue. This one will be with our cameras on. We'll be able to see each other's faces, and we'll actually be able to talk. So take a moment to think about that 1-minute question as we wrap up. And I also want to encourage you all to continue to look at our website to look for resources to see what other sessions we are offering to continue that education. So we're going to take a minute to let people think, and then we're going to switch over to the meeting. All right, friends. Well, you are totally welcome to start heading over to that meeting where we can maybe discuss this a little bit more. Thank you all once again for attending. That link to the meeting is in the chat. So I'm personally going to stick around here for a moment longer to make sure everybody gets to the link. But I just want to say thank you to you all, and we will see you hopefully in the meeting. But if not, thank you for attending. Oh, wow. Someone did answer. They said the most surprising thing to me was redlining and how policies like that affected communities years ago and still affect today. Thank you. Thank you all so much. The K-12 team can pop on here and say thank you as well from our education staff. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
See you all in the meeting.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all who came out and attended.